Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our session this morning using technology to eliminate cash forecasting roadblocks. We hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy and appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Treasurers were already focused on enhancing their forecast methodologies in 2020 when the pandemic hit, plunging most organizations into a working capital crisis. Today, Treasury Strategies and HighRadius will dive into how treasurers are using technology to develop enhanced cash forecasting approaches to improve management of cash, liquidity, and working capital. Our presenters today include Jeff DiOrio, Director and Co-Head of Treasury Strategies, as well as Tracy Ferguson-Knight, Director, Solution Engineering at HighRadius. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The session will be about an hour long, with time for Q&A at the end. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and we will respond at the end of the session if time allows, or via email after the session. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a recording link and a copy of the presentation following the presentation. With that, I will hand it over to Jeff and Tracy.
Thank you, Katie. This is Jeff DiOrio, and I'd like to introduce my co-speakers, Tracy Ferguson-Knight.
Hey,
and I've known Tracy for quite a few years now. This is probably the second job I've known her in, and I'm very excited because she's been an adherent of, go ahead. Hi, Tracy. Tracy's been an adherent to forecasting for a long time. She's with HighRadius, and they've got some pretty interesting technology for forecasting. On today's call, we are going to be going through an agenda of reviewing why focusing on forecasting and what some of the challenges are. We'll be talking about roadblocks that are eliminated by technology, leveraging artificial intelligence, which I think really has gotten to a point that it's useful in this scenario. And then we'll be taking questions. And we will be taking questions. We realize that these are extraordinary times and people probably do have a lot of questions. And so hopefully we can get through all the questions that you submit. You can submit them through the Q&A feature here. We'll also be doing a poll or two. And all of this combines to make this CTP eligible. So if you want to get credits, you can certainly apply. It's an hour long, and we think that it's very, very pertinent. On the topic of forecasting, this is something I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm sure everybody on this call has to do some sort of forecasting. And I can tell you that in my day-to-day job, doing forecasting is not something I look forward to. I try and find ways to make it as efficient as possible and minimize the impact. We're hoping to give you some points to either help improve the way they some tips and tricks on how to avoid some of the pitfalls. So with that, why don't we jump right in? We'll start with some of the research Treasury Strategies has done on the topic. And this is pretty interesting because we did a study going into the beginning of the year, which is called the State of the Treasury Profession. We did an online survey, and we did a bunch of interviews of treasurers and assistant treasurers and directors, pretty much everybody in Treasury. If you want to talk to us, we were talking to you. And going into the crisis, so we gave the presentation on March 4th. And so a lot of the interviews took place as the pandemic was evolving, and just as we gave the presentation. So what's interesting in some of the forces that were impacting Treasury and people talked about were geopolitical factors. Well, COVID-19 was definitely one of them, but they also mentioned the trade wars and the election, which I think are all still very relevant topics. Interest rates and liquidity, and a point to be made here is I think 90% of what I heard are still very much, it was almost like all of the treasurers and people in Treasury were prescient, and everything they were focused on only got magnified by the pandemic. It didn't divert people off of projects that they should have been doing all along. So Liquidity is something everybody jumped on. The economy, and at the time people were talking about near full-term employment. Of course, that's slightly different now. The recession concerns were there at the time. And then, on the other side, there were M&A and fraud attempts. Well, fraud attempts are definitely one area where I think we've all seen things kick up, and the LIBOR replacement is something that we'll have to deal with next year. So these were sort of the framework of what people were talking about. But again, some of the things that people said were on their initiative list were simply magnified, or I think I used a post and I said they got rocket fuel just because I watched that really cool SpaceX rocket launch. And so this is a slide that describes the top priorities. It was a survey, an online survey, and you can see we track year after year. We ask the same questions mostly. We added working capital to it 2 years ago. And you can see in 18, 19, and 20, forecasting really has been in the top 5, the #1 spot really for Treasury operations. And you say, well, of course we've been forecasting. It's part of what we do. We're Treasury Department or we're finance. And but it is this. And again, this survey was done from December of last year to the end of February. And this is how things ranked out. So it is very interesting that forecasting is still remains #1 on people's to-do list. And this was before the pandemic. Then we asked people, what do you view as opportunities in 2020? What are you focusing on in your Treasury for 2020? And again, the timing of this is sort of pre and just at the cusp of the pandemic. Working capital improvements were something everybody was focusing on. And they were focusing on it because DSO, DPO, that ratio has not changed very much in the last 10, 15 years. There are technologies out there that help you improve that, and Tracy's organization is one of the ones that is out there really helping with that. But organizations were realizing that terms were not being adhered to, both on the outbound and the inbound side, and there were other things. And Treasury departments were finally being given the remit to sort of address the whole thing, because it's an issue that falls across a couple of different parts of the organization. And so you can see cost containment and new technologies. Those were the primary drivers around working capital. As the pandemic hit, of course, a lot of organizations saw their working capital turn upside down, or at least that's how I'm describing it. And so that initiative got even more focus, which, while getting more focus for a bad reason, I think is really good for Treasury and Finance that it got more focus. If you look at some of the other things that they talked about as reasons for focusing on it, they were related. People are definitely looking at new technologies. And there are a lot of new technologies out there, and we're going to talk about some of them today. There's changes to payments, Treasury evolving as a key business processor, and then access to capital. So at the time we were talking about lower cost of capital, I've heard terms like the banks seem to be using COVID pricing these days, but cost of capital is certainly having the capital and liquidity is one of the things that has become much more of a focus. And then on that, we then had a webinar with following research on what Treasury should focus on, and we talked about 3 different areas, sort of like a sequence of how you're going to respond. There was short-term liquidity management. A lot of firms went out, just got all the liquidity they could to make sure they had the cash on hand. But the forecasting became something. I had an interview with the treasurer last week, and he said, yeah, my team are thrilled with me because we went from forecasting once a week to forecasting multiple times a day. Working capital management has really, really elevated, and we predicted that you should focus on it, partly because people told us that's what they were doing. And you can know that most of your peers are very, very focused on making sure that their receivables are as much as they can make them to be, and that their payables are maintained as well. So the working capital tying in with the forecasting and the overall corporation were very, very high areas. And then there's the operational risk, which is around avoiding fraud and automating your billing and collection systems. And that's an area quite a few organizations got caught short on. But I think 1 and 2 are really good drivers for why we're doing this session today. And on that note, we're now going to move into what some of the challenges are.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. You know, the things that you've talked about so far, it's amazing just how relevant companies' priorities were prior to the pandemic, and how the pandemic really has just amplified everything companies were already thinking about. You know, fraud control and those operational controls and putting in place more automation was already there. And now we know it to be extra crucial, and it's what really allows companies to be able to work remotely and kind of disparate from each other. And same for cash forecasting and working capital management. So I think we would have, the presentation that we're doing today would have already have been relevant had we been giving it in January, and now it's just even more so.
Yep. And so while some of the topics here are just general long-term, some I think some of you that are listening to the webinar will acknowledge that you've been put under a lot more stress to do the forecast more frequently and have the forecast be more accurate. And so that's one of the reasons this is so relevant. Now, let's talk a little bit about the barriers, because if you don't identify what the barriers, a lot of people say, I hate doing the forecast, I have so many issues with it. One of the things we do when Treasury Strategies does a forecasting project is to identify what the issues are so they can be addressed, and make sure everybody acknowledges what the issues are so they can be addressed. Because sometimes the person doing the forecast can feel like they're out in a boat in the middle of a storm and they have no engine because nobody's helping them. And so getting everybody on board and at least participating or understanding the importance of it is probably a really big solution to the problem of being the forecast person. And we talk about you know, what are some of the issues. So insufficient resourcing, that's definitely being addressed. People are telling me that at a C level, the whole organization is being informed that they've got to pull together and help out with this. So hopefully that level of participation continues as we come out of the pandemic. Poor information and access to information or exchange of information. I think, Tracy, you're going to talk about this quite a bit as we get into the nuts and bolts of how you might use artificial intelligence to help with your forecast. Garbage in, garbage out is something that people always have to think about. And then, of course, there's tools, but we'll talk about what kinds of tools you can leverage. And then inconsistencies between short-term forecast and the budgetary forecast, and we're definitely going to talk about that today. And organizations have been addressing this. Because in some cases, go ahead, Tracy, did you have something to add?
Yeah, that last item on the left, you put the low interest rate environment, I think has been one of the biggest drivers that kind of led to a company's general posture related to forecasting. If they were net investors, because interest rates have been so low, there seemed to have been very little interest in forecasting, thinking that, well, we always have enough cash. It doesn't matter if we invest, you know, overnight or out 30 days. There's pretty much no difference from an interest rate environment. Net debtors carried a little bit more about it because they would sometimes need to, you know, make your bank aware of the fact that you need to borrow for 3 or 4 days in advance, and so it helps to have a forecast so that you're making the right decisions at the right time. But now, all companies, because of the kind of the cash crunch, if you are a net investor, you don't want to see your money literally dwindle away, and you need to have a plan for having perhaps decreasing cash. If you are already a net borrower, well, the situation might be much more you know, complex. That cash crunch might be serious. And so being able to see and have an accurate forecast and being able to plan for it, we're still under this low interest rate environment, but the need for the forecast has really increased. And I think if and as interest rates rise, it'll become that much more so. And
Yeah.
so I think that's been one of the things that's made so many companies kind of complacent about forecasting in the past.
Very good point, Tracy. So moving on, we'd like to talk about the forecasting process, and we're going to hit different aspects of this process on throughout this presentation. And so you can see that on the left-hand side, the data sources are being fed in, and this process is performed by everybody to some degree, regardless of your level of automation. This is a really good description of a process you do, whether you realize you're doing it or not. So you've got data sources, whether they be the bank or some other systems or just people sending you emails or phone calls. You gather the data and you consolidate it. And unfortunately, way too many of us do this in Excel. And then there's the execution. So you've got the forecasting model, and you have to compile everything and put it in the model, and you're going to project some things based on stuff you know. And then there's reporting out to users. Finally, step 3 is variance analysis, where you are comparing how good your forecast has been. And the reason for doing this is, and too many companies don't do this or don't do it effectively, and the reason for doing this is a forecast is a very educated guess. It is not knowing. And so by having variance analysis as part of your process, you can then decide how effective your forecast has been. And a point to be made here, perfection is unattainable. So you have to decide how much of a variance is acceptable. We'll talk about that a little later. But if you don't have variance analysis baked into your process, there's no way to refine the process. And step 5 is there is a refinement. And just understand, it is a process. It is a process that you repetitively perform. And I think a few too many people don't do the variance analysis and don't give the refinement the attention it requires. Tracy, you probably have some thoughts on this slide.
Yeah, the very word you said, that this is a repetitive process, something that has to be done over and over again. And that very word repetitive usually means it's an opportunity for technology. And so we've highlighted here the areas in particular that technology can have an initial impact. You can gather information electronically, letting systems talk to each other, and getting data directly from the source instead of necessarily going to individual people around your company to collect information. The technology can build the forecast. The models can be embedded in the technology such that it's putting together the forecast and doing the variance analysis of gathering information from your banks and comparing the actuals to versions of your forecast. When I say versions of your forecast, I mean across all different durations. Usually in a manual environment, you might do some variance analysis, but it might be just 1 day forecast or 1 week forecast. But can you imagine having 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, having all kinds of different versions of your forecast with different durations and how well those different forecasts performed? And then being able to repeat that over and over and over again automatically so that your time is spent on that analysis of what's happened, maybe identifying better sources of data for categories for that you perhaps want to refine further and to get the variance down closer on certain categories. And so your time can be spent in other areas improving the forecast as opposed to just creating it.
I think that's an excellent point. I see a lot of resistance to the adoption of technology. And partly it's, and we'll talk about this some more, partly it's because people don't realize that by improving the process, you've added value to the organization, and you can spend more time focusing on ways to help the organization versus sitting there gathering data and crunching it into a spreadsheet. So as we move on, Tracy mentioned data sources. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but suffice it to say there are a number of data sources. Some are better than others. And if you're struggling, you might look at the data sources as the first place to help improve your forecast. Obviously very good bank reporting. The banks are the final truth for what happened cash flow wise. Your ERP, very, very good source. As we swing around this horseshoe of data, you can finally get to spreadsheet models. And spreadsheet models are probably one of the weaker elements to your forecast, partly because they're spreadsheets and also partly because you're not getting that information from really good line managers, or you're not doing it other ways. And I think, Tracy, some of these are items where the artificial intelligence can kick in and leverage off of this data, right?
Most definitely. Utilizing machine learning, technology can connect directly to your ERP or to the banks, have the models embedded within the technology such that it's creating the forecast, doing that comparison to give the variance analysis, but then utilizing the results of that to further improve. The idea behind artificial intelligence and machine learning is just that it can learn from past performance and then improve going forward. And so what you should get is accuracy continuing to increase the longer you utilize a system where artificial intelligence and machine learning is built into the models.
This item shouldn't bear much explanation, but as Kathy Bates said in The Waterboy, spreadsheets are the devil. If you've got you're dramatically driven by spreadsheets and you've got these huge spreadsheets that link 50,000 things, it's a necessary evil, to carry that analogy forward, but it's something you need to start looking at getting away from. If you're, and I got to tell you, 80% of the people we talk to do it this way, especially in this world. The other systems weren't architected to move fast enough. And what we're hoping is you'll get some ideas from this presentation that you can apply to get you away from the spreadsheets.
So what this crisis has done, though, is kind of change the cadence associated with forecasting. You mentioned earlier that you've talked to companies that were doing it maybe weekly in the past and now are doing it daily or even multiple times a day. And that's exactly what I've been hearing as well from both net investors and net debtors. If you are fairly casual about forecasting in the past, maybe you have plenty of cash, and maybe we're just looking at it quarterly or monthly or kind of ad hoc, chances are there's more of a cadence now to being monthly or bi-weekly. But if you are already struggling a bit, if you are already debtors really looking to improve and maybe going through some kind of formal process monthly or weekly, well, now it's weekly or daily. I've talked to companies that say they have a daily meeting with the CFO where they're literally talking about how the forecast is looking, how it's changing, what they're doing to try and accelerate AR, yet being sensitive to their partners and not being, not having a heavy hand when it comes to collections, yet very much focused on collections. And then on the other side, on payables, really figuring out what companies and vendors they want to ensure that they maintain a very good relationship with. And those bills that really should be paid on time, if not early, even as you're working and figuring out how to pay everything, but just timing it all very, very carefully. So that process has just really been amplified, and the cadence just increased significantly under today's environment.
Yeah, Tracy, I've spoken with so many different treasuries in the past few weeks, and one treasurer, as I mentioned earlier, said my team are getting sick of me asking them to revise the forecast multiple times a day, but it's something they need to do.
not only that, but looking at the key indicators, of which usually AR and AP, you're usually the biggest impacts by both dollars, as well as traditionally even the most difficult to forecast. So watching these closely is really what you're trying to do when you're increasing this cadence, when you're having these meetings daily or weekly. It's really focused in on the key indicators, so that that you're updating them regularly with changing conditions, which, as you all know, are just changing so rapidly right now.
Okay, so we've gotten to our first poll question, and we are doing a bit of a survey associated with this, which also helps with your CTP credits. So if you can, we would like you to answer to the pop-up to note which is your biggest challenge in forecasting.
Right, accurately predicting when you're going to receive payments from your customers and kind of forecasting AR. Is it reconciling your direct or your treasury forecast versus your indirect or your FP&A type cash forecast? Is it getting quality data and inputs from different people and systems whose priorities are often not the same as yours? Or is it tracking variance of your forecast and getting that good variance analysis so you can see what's creating the differences in your forecast and figuring out how to improve your forecast going forward?
Yep. And while we're waiting for people to give you a little time to answer, which shouldn't take very long, if, I was just thinking we should have had an other category so that people could put in whatever they want. If you have specific questions, Tracy and my email are back at the beginning of this presentation. You will get a copy of the presentation, so you'll have it. And don't hesitate to reach out. We're really big on thought leadership, and so we're happy to answer any questions. Okay. So as we look at the results here, that's interesting.
It is. I was expecting what I guess came in number 2 to be number 1. I hear that predicting AR is always one of the most difficult things to do. But it looks like the big winner today is getting quality data inputs from people and systems. I had already said that often other people's priorities just aren't the same as yours. So they might kind of throw something together quickly, but not necessarily with the same amount of thought and effort that you put into it.
There was a presentation I gave at Texpo a few years ago, and somebody said, what can I do to help motivate people to give me better data? And I said, is it a lot of people or is it a handful of people? And she said, it's a handful of people. And I said, lunch and drinks. Take them out for lunch, beg them, and pour alcohol into them so that they'll agree. But it is about building, and I think this, like I said, one of the positives coming out of this pandemic situation is that organizations realize that everybody has to participate in this. Okay, now we'll be talking about, I think it's 4 roadblocks, right, that you talk about, Tracy?
Yes. On the next slide, you'll see that getting data, real-time data from different sources across geographies and business units, that comes right back to actually what you all listed as being one of your top concerns, how to get information that you need easily and getting accurate information. 2 is integrating with banks to get good data to perform variance analysis. 3, running what-if scenarios so that you can really see the impact and have some possible mitigating strategies on how to deal with your forecast. And 4, building a bottom-up forecast for increased accuracy at the regional and global levels. So let's get into those. Next slide, there we go. Gathering data the traditional way is usually about talking to people, getting emails, maybe some phone calls, even sending out maybe an Excel template that others are supposed to fill out, maybe country controllers or people in different departments, sometimes logging in to various systems or banks manually, doing all this and gathering it together in spreadsheets. I've seen some fairly simple spreadsheets and I've seen some that are fairly horrific which might be working for the person who created it, but imagine if you were the person who had to inherit that. Usually you throw it away and start all over again. But with technology, all this can happen automatically, or at least most of it. Systems can directly extract information from your ERP around AR, around AP. Systems can automatically pull in information from your banks and pull in what's actually happening there for variance analysis. If you've got other unique billing systems, payroll systems, taxes, whatever systems might have information that is changing often, you might want to pull in information directly from the system and or give other users, remote users, or all around the globe, direct access where they can enter in their forecast information directly into the system, as opposed to giving it to you and you somehow consolidating the information. But in all cases, even with the system, you still need that ability to have a manual impact on your forecast. Sometimes there are things that have happened, like COVID-19, things that could not have been predicted by a model, but upon which you need to have a direct impact on the model and the bottom line forecast. And so you
Yeah,
can do that with digital technology.
I really like giving the users direct access to it, and it encourages them both to input and to review. And I remember treasurer, gosh, this was a long time ago, said to me, I said, well, why do you pretty much just make everybody contribute to the forecast and you're not doing really cool modeling and whatnot? And his response to me was, it's their responsibility for knowing what's going to happen in their business unit. I'm going to give them a framework within which to update that, and then I'm going to have a way to measure it with variance analysis to tell them what they're good at and what they're bad at. And quite frankly, if they're really bad at certain things, they're going to get a call from the CFO. And I thought that was just a brilliant concept, but in a positive light, giving them access to the tools so that it's not some black box and that they can review what's going on and they can see the data. It should get them to participate more vigorously.
Yeah, we're going to talk about variance analysis, in fact, right now, which is what's key. If you can't provide anyone feedback with how well they've done, or even you, how well you've done in the past at forecasting, how do you improve? How do you figure out if you need new sources of data or better sources of data or more frequent sources of data? Without regular variance analysis, it's almost impossible to improve.
Right. And so
so
these steps here, right, these steps here could be done by really great automation, but even if you don't have great automation, you're probably doing some of these steps. Is that correct, Tracy?
I think you're doing them, but usually not well, and typically for only one duration. So within Treasury, I often see it's just a daily forecast to actual, not really even I'll call it daily forecast to actual in terms of your cash position, but not a true forecast. So it's not measuring your 1 week view or your 1 month view to where you ended up. Instead, it's just tomorrow to where it ended up.
Yeah, and that's forecast to cash, not forecast to budget. And forecast to budget's even harder to get, and a lot of people are focused on that these days because they need to know how far out they are to make sure that they're still in business. And so the multiple frequencies and ways to look at the forecast are important. Being able to analyze some things by line item or time period, and then having a model, which hopefully can be assisted by AI, but to analyze how effective it is so you know how to tune it. And then, of course, the rinse and repeat comment, which brings you back to the beginning. This is something that you should have built into your process that you do, maybe not every single time, but frequently enough to tune the model, because the model always has to be tuned, especially as we got into this event, right? A lot of the historical models had to be revised radically because the way they were performing in 2019 is not the way they're performing in 20. So you always have to look at the model. And automation makes this so much easier. The flip side of that is it really is very difficult to do it well without automation.
That's right. On this next slide, I've got an example of just one screenshot that shows how variance analysis, for example, can even be done when it's done by a system, maybe down to the category or the subcategory level, so that you can really identify the areas that are creating the variance, whether that be by company or country, currency, company code, entity, category, subcategory. And by really digging into the source of your variances, you can then figure out, well, how can I improve this area? How can I work on the places that will actually make a difference in my overall forecast? If you focus on certain categories that really don't have a major impact on your forecast, you're putting your time in the wrong place. And so by bringing in data automatically and having the system create that initial variance across a variety of different forecast horizons, you can then really work on improving it. Now, keep in mind that with artificial intelligence, machine learning, the system is going to be working to improve the model itself, but you are in control of the data sources. And so that's why I say, if you see that there are particular categories that really have a large variance, then that's where you and your vendor of choice need to dig in and begin to identify potential other sources and or just variables within or from a source to take better account of in the model. And I'll kind of go into more detail about how artificial intelligence works in just a second.
Yeah, and again, to highlight a point Tracy's made and I made a little earlier, this is a tool or an approach that consolidates it grinds the data down for you and it prepares it for you so that you are able to analyze it and make effective decisions. And so, artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's not a magic wand that instantly takes care of all your problems, but it does help take away an awful lot of the grunt work to get you to the point where you can now analyze something that will effectively allow you to make decisions.
That's right. And part of those decisions that you might want to make can be impacted by running a few different what-if scenarios. The traditional approach, doing your forecast in Excel and doing some what-ifs, usually ends up being some fairly simplistic methodologies, like just a shift in interest rates or a simple shift in maybe AR, a particular category. So more or less kind of a parallel shift and seeing what difference that might make. But imagine you can do more sophisticated scenario analysis. You might build a variety of possible what ifs. When you think about the current pandemic, what people expect really varies significantly. Some think that the curve might be more V-shaped, that just as we had this rapid drop-off, they're expecting the recovery to be just as rapid, while others think it's more L-shaped, that the recovery is going to take a long time, that the state of unemployment is pushing us into recession, and therefore the recovery is going to take quite a while. Others say maybe more of a W-shaped curve. How are these different possible ways the recovery might happen? What impact is that going to have on my cash? Are my credit lines big enough? Are they going to last long enough to carry me through this? Or is it looking good and I don't need to worry about restructuring it or lengthening it or there's any number of different possibilities. But if you can't run your different scenarios, how do you know what mitigating strategies you might need to take? So this is another way that technology can help.
Very good. And now we're going to talk about one of the challenges that most organizations are dealing with, have dealt with, and it's something they're having to deal with now. Tracy, I think this is one of the areas that you are very passionate about.
Yes, I think it's so common for companies to do kind of a top-down approach to their forecasts. Often because it's coming sometimes from FP&A, who definitely is taking more of a kind of a global view, a budget view of the forecast, and maybe breaking that down by companies or kind of pushing it down a little bit. But what makes more sense, at least from a treasury true cash perspective, is to do more of a bottoms-up approach, where you're forecasting by entity or company code, country or currency, and you do that at the lowest possible level, and then roll that forecast up into regions, roll those up globally. And then you'll have that global forecast in the end. But if you're able to build your forecast this way, you do your variance analysis along the very same lines. Now, in addition to taking people out for lunch and drinks, you can actually give them some real data about their individual performance. I talked to one company, I remember years ago, who said he used to kind of make it more of a contest among the people who contributed information into his forecast. And by providing them detailed results in variance analysis, then they were able to want to improve and kind of made it a bit of a competition, and would sometimes try to reward those that were most accurate in their contributions.
Right. I love the phrase somebody once gave me. It's not what you expect, it's what you inspect. And so the variance analysis really helps highlight who's effective and who isn't. And to summarize this, we've got, the two approaches to forecasting. So you've got the indirect that Tracy talked about, the top-down, which tends to focus on the budget. And then you've got the direct, which is typically what Treasury is doing, where they're building it bottoms up. They're saying, this is what happened and this is what I expect to happen because you're worried about cash and you've got a shorter time frame. And it's syncing those two that are a challenge that a lot of people are dealing with right now. But you have to recognize that they have different goals, they have different perspectives, they're different measurement of cash. In the indirect FP&A model, free cash flow is a plug that's between, outbound and inbound. Whereas in the Treasury model, it's just the cash flow. So there's a lot of different aspects here. And Tracy, I think today we're really just focusing on the direct cash forecasting model versus the FP&A.
Very much. Just money in and out of the bank, and when is it likely to happen?
Very good. So now, a case study.
That's right. Let's take a look at exactly what it means when we say artificial intelligence and how it can be used in helping with building an accurate forecast and how that's different from what you might be doing in a manual environment. In a manual environment, companies, if they wanted to predict something like AR, they often take an average days to pay approach, where they might calculate what their average has been in the past between the date they issue invoices and the date they actually receive money in the bank. So if, for example, that was 37 days, they would, going forward, just add that to all the invoices issued each day and have that be the predicted payment date. But instead, if they had the ability to, they would actually calculate a customer-specific average days to pay, where you can clearly see that customer A behaves significantly different than customers B and C, where they all have different averages. If you had that, you could add that to the invoice dates issued to those particular customers and have a more accurate predicted payment date. But if you could drill down, sorry.
I was going to say the benefit of automation is also to automate the customer-specific ADP, isn't it?
It is one of the aspects of what artificial intelligence can do in a very quick and automated way. But I've seen many customers do this, even if they're just keeping track of their top 10 or their top 20 customers, they might still do this even in a manual Excel-driven environment. But the idea is if you could add on more and more variables, you could get more and more accurate. So imagine you drilled down on customer B and you were able to look at the amounts of their invoices. You might see that their average days to pay is very high when their invoice amounts are high. And the average days to pay are very low when their invoice amounts are low. So as you'll see on the next slide, as you add on more variables, your accuracy in payment date becomes more and more accurate. And so this has been done and can be done manually, particularly when you're dealing with maybe just 10 or 20 customers. But what if you have 50 or 100 or 1,000 or even hundreds of thousands of customers? This is virtually impossible to do in Excel or any kind of manual environment. That's where artificial intelligence comes into play. On the next slide, you'll see that we can take any number of different variables and use those to correctly and accurately predict a payment date. In reality, if we were to pull in information from your ERP, that might be master level data related to your customers and your invoices. Maybe there are 60 or more different fields there. But we can scientifically correlate which variables impact when your customers actually pay. So maybe we narrow that list down to 30. So then we pull in information from your ERP across those 30 variables. We apply the right algorithm, of which there are more than 25 different types of artificial intelligence algorithms. But if a data sciences team does this work, they're able to apply the right algorithms for every different category in your forecast, especially those that you're going to use artificial intelligence for, which tends to be AR and AP, ones with a lot of data and usually fairly difficult to predict. But utilizing all this, you can then come up with a fairly accurate predicted payment date. So the goal then is on the next slide to build a forecast where you're really looking at each category individually. You might apply that big hammer, that AI hammer, where it's looking and statistically utilizing your data coming from other systems to build both short and long-term forecasts. Short-term means as long as you typically have due dates. So if your terms are net 30, then your short-term forecast might be just out to 30 days. If it's net 60, then your short-term might go out 60 days. But you can also use historical bank information or historical data coming out of your ERP to also build a long-term forecast. So for AR and AP, you're going to usually use this really big hammer, this AI hammer. But for other categories, you might use more heuristic type models. Those are more like you would do in Excel. Averaging, regression, maybe even just recurring items. Payroll, if you're in a company where it's not going to change significantly, you might literally just put in the same number recurring every other week, and that would be accurate enough. The goal is not to have, I'll call it overkill. You don't want to spend more time, more effort, more time building links and processes than you need to for each and every different category. So you want to use the method that makes sense category by category. When it comes to something even like investments and debt cash flows, if you use a treasury management system, maybe you'll want to pull in those forecasted cash flows related to interest payments and maturity flows. And then you still always need the ability to put in things manually, maybe a coming acquisition or divestiture, a special payment, or maybe you're temporarily suspending dividends, any number of different things that a system can't predict based on history because it just doesn't happen at any kind of with regularity, or maybe it's never even happened before. So you need to be able to impact your forecast manually. But the goal is to utilize this method, building a forecast, as the next slide shows, for each and every different entity or company code or country or currency, roll those up into categories and regions, and then roll those up globally. So I know I covered that fairly fast. I wanted to leave this in here as a poll question so you can put in if you'd like to learn a little bit more about artificial intelligence and how it might be able to be used well to improve the forecast at your company. So if you'll enter that in, we'll take that into account and reach out to you accordingly.
And as we're waiting for people to respond, Tracy, I think I've had so many people ask me, is there a better tool out there to help me with my forecasting? And I think a lot of people realize that when you have a unicorn event like a pandemic, that's going to throw some of the statistical models off, but having a tool that can be tuned and quickly adjusted and run as automatically as it can to adjust for variability that comes through this is nice. And the other thing that I think is really important is the tools finally do exist. These existed for a lot of other organizations to use machine learning and artificial intelligence in the past, and it's finally available now for Treasury to really do what you need. And it doesn't have to run on a Cray computer in a super secret location. It's available as a SaaS solution that ties in with everything. And so even if you don't think that it will help, I think it's important to have a plan for how you're going to improve what you're doing. And so hopefully a couple of the points we've made today tie in with that.
Definitely, and you don't have to show your age by mentioning a Cray computer. You went way back for that one.
That was way back, yeah. I remember a statistical model we ran on when we were so excited. So in conclusion, we're going to hit a couple of points, and then we're going to try and answer some of the questions that you've asked. So, on the better forecasting leads to better working capital management, which is a very important thing. And in the past, a lot of people at organizations would bristle at the fact that you were asking them for a forecast. I can tell you I was one of them, and I still am to a degree. Every time they ask me for a forecast, I think to myself, how much time is this going to take me away from doing what I really do for this company? But this is important. So coming up with a better forecast, here are some key takeaways. So closely monitoring your cash flows and the cash conversion cycle to detect signs of a liquidity crisis are super important. Do you want to do it daily? Well, I think many of us have been forced to do it daily, and hopefully you found ways to make that easier. And hopefully this webinar has given you some ideas on how to improve that. And it is confidence, right, Tracy? It's a confidence thing. If you come up with a forecast and you're just so far off every single time, that's not good, right? It has to have some level of confidence to it.
That's right. If it's repeatable and with technology where you're doing that automated variance analysis, then you can see how well the system is forecasting. And you can utilize that so that when you're providing information in the future, you can say, based on past history, this forecast, when I'm giving it to you 1 month out, or maybe out to the end of the quarter, this has been the average variance over the last 6 months, over the last 3 months. Now that we're in this crisis, it might be just, this is how we've been performing over the last month, and we think we're getting better at it. So this is, how much you can depend on and make decisions based on the forecast numbers that I'm giving you. And
yes.
So that's something that technology can really help with, and help that reforecasting daily so that it can help manage that cadence so that it's not just a manual process being done over and over again.
Yes, and the one of the things we've touched on, but people are very resistant to change. And in some cases, people feel it's a career-limiting move to move away from the monolithic spreadsheet that they use because it's the value they bring to the company. And to sell this internally, I think you really need to push people to say, we're moving you away from being a number cruncher, which is a low-value capability to this organization, and we're allowing you to become more of a real true analyst that's making strategic business decisions. Treasury is sort of moving into being the strategic partner. It was on one of the early slides. That is the objective of many treasuries for 2020, and this is sort of accelerating that process. And then finally, I think Tracy and I are both adherents of the fact that by leveraging technology better, you can get a better forecast. And as I said, I do this in my own forecasting. I can tell you that in the last couple of months, I have dramatically improved the linkage with internal systems for coming up with what's happened and getting more people involved to describe what's going to happen. And if they allow me, I'm going to be a beta tester for some of the stuff Tracy's talking about. So, and then on Tracy, I think, you can see that if you're trying to sell your boss on why you need to do this, these are some good points for you. And if you're the boss trying to sell your people on why they need to do this, these are some points. So automation will result in time savings. People will have more time to do the analysis and value-added services to the organization, and they're out of the data collection. Accuracy will allow you to make better decisions. So the variance analysis tying in with it, right, that's pretty important.
The automation and the accuracy improvements can result in real hard dollar ROI savings. So you can often justify the acquisition of a SaaS solution for this simply on your accuracy and automation improvements alone. And then you've got all those kind of really soft improvements, which I call greater confidence. You know, as a CFO wants to be accurate when planning and pulling those different levers to plan for quarterly reporting, whether they be kind of external to Wall Street around cash and the balance sheet, or whether it be to stakeholders if you're owned by private equity. Either way, the CFO wants to have confidence in the measures that are being taken to manage the business and to plan for that quarterly forecast. And wouldn't it be better to have confidence in the numbers that you give to him or her than seeing wild variances by the time you get to the end of the quarter? Now,
Yes.
we've had a question come in, Jeff.
Yeah.
It says, could we please talk about the use in AI in forecasting other categories, not just AR or AP? And what I would say is those tend to be the categories that often have the greatest variances. You can utilize AI for any category, but the idea is that you need to have a sufficient amount of data to actually form real statistical correlations. And so if it's a low data area, let's say like maybe taxes or payroll oftentimes, then because it happens so infrequently, then those are not necessarily good candidates for AI. Sometimes just basic regression or, as I mentioned, averaging can often take care of those. So I stress AR and AP simply because of the volume and the volatility that is often seen there. But technically, AI could be used for any category for which you have good data, both historical as well as sources going forward.
Okay. And a final point on this slide is if you are trying to encourage your boss or you're trying to encourage your team to take advantage of this, you can tell them that most of their peers are focused on this in 2020. So before we end the presentation, I thought I'd mention a little bit about HighRadius. Tracy, I was surprised when I went to the conference to see how you had evolved over the years. Any leading thoughts for people?
Yeah, HighRadius has really been focused traditionally on everything to do with order to cash. So that's cash applications, deductions, collections, credit, and electronic invoicing and payment presentment. But we've recently, just starting last year, kind of moved into treasury management as well, with a high focus on cash forecasting. We've been utilizing artificial intelligence to focus AR for many years, and now we're just moving into a new space, taking existing technology that we've been doing for a long time into other areas.
Okay. Well, we answered one question, and I'm sure there are others. What I'd like to encourage you to do, since we're at time, is to email us, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. For those of you that have asked questions that we weren't able to get to, we will respond to you in writing as well. We want to thank you for attending this session. We hope it's valuable. You will receive a copy of the deck, and you will receive a link to the recording in case you found it very valuable and you want the rest of your teams to listen to it. And we thank you. We hope you're all doing well, and we hope that this was valuable to you.
Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Tracy.
Bye-bye.